the view from the British settlers and the colonials themselves, I mean, you make the distinction that the British often sought to help natives because they saw it was culture, not biology, that had prevented them from development. I think this is an incredibly important distinction because I believe it dispels the idea that the British Empire was essentially racist. Am I right?
Yes, Fred, it's really important for us to pause and think about what we mean by racism. So racism as the contempt of one people for another, unfortunately, is a universal human vice, and it's disgusting. And there was too much of that in the British Empire. But the most vicious form of racism is that which regards another people as naturally, genetically, biologically inferior, and therefore forever destined to be ruled by another race. So the ideology of white supremacism would be an example of that. But I'm pleased to report that although scientific biological racism did gain traction toward the end of the 19th century, it never displaced the earlier Christian view, which had propelled the movement to abolish slavery and the slave trade throughout the empire in the early 1800s. The Christian view that all human beings are basically equal, regardless of race and regardless of cultural development under God. And the prevailing view in the British Empire was that native peoples, under the right conditions, could become quite as civilized, quite as developed as native Britons. And so that's why in Cape Colony in South Africa and in New Zealand and in Eastern Canada from the 1850s onwards, the vote is granted to native peoples on equal terms as to white people.
Well, the benevolence of the empire is an incredibly provocative thing. To talk about the benevolence of the empire is very provocative these days. You also make the point in the book that no culture has a right to assume it can survive forever. Why have these ideas, which it also is perfectly reasonable if it's not a very good culture, why have these ideas become so anathema these days, Professor?
Yeah, Fred, just on benevolence, I mean, let me be clear, let's all be clear that the motives for British Empire were various, and trade was the basic one. But you're quite right, from the early 1800s, the humanitarian mission of the empire grew in strength. Now, why has that become so difficult to talk about now? I think the basic reason is that you Australians and we British and New Zealanders and Canadians, we all share the same languages as the Americans. So I think what's happened, certainly in my country, this debate has, or the idea rather, that British colonialism was nothing but a litany of racism and exploitation and gross violence. That's really taken off in the last 2.5 years, ever since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the Black Lives Matter rapidly came across the Atlantic to us. And oftentimes, to my irritation, and I speak as someone who's married to an American, we British seem to forget we're not American. And the history of race in Britain is quite different from that in America. Now, Australia has had its own controversy. I'm aware of that for some long time. But I do sometimes, I do think that the English-speaking parts of the world that are not America are often susceptible to American preoccupations, which has shot this view of Anglo culture as essentially racist right to the center of public attention.